Good morning. Welcome, welcome. Here we are in part 2 of the workshop, Getting the Most Out of Meditation. I'll get started in just about 2 minutes so you have time to kind of settle in. We're absolutely going to meditate in today's session, so whatever you need to get yourself comfortable for meditation, that is perfect. I realized when I was preparing for part 1 or for the workshop, Getting the Most Out of Meditation, that I was trying to just cram so much into one workshop. And really there's a second aspect of practice that can be enabled once we more skillfully move ourselves through the checklist, which I described in part 1, which I'll be recapping here. So don't worry if you don't remember all the steps to that checklist. But I realized that there's this whole other aspect of meditative practice that can be enabled once we really skillfully learn how to move ourselves through those first 6 steps that really bring us to a place of a deepening meditation practice. So that's primarily what I'm going to focus on here today. I'll get started in just about 1 more minute. And as I mentioned, I'll do a recap of the steps that I described in last week's Getting the Most Out of Meditation workshop, and then I'll take us into the deepening aspects that can be enabled once we really start to get skill with those first 6 steps. Okay, so that'll be the focus of today's session. We'll get started, I think, in just another 30 or so seconds. I'm excited to share this with you. I've never quite given this teaching before, so it's fun to share something new with the gang. I hope you're happy and excited to be here. Closing the door or opening the windows, letting people know that you might not want to be disturbed for the next hour or so can be helpful. And it looks like we are right on the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Take a deep breath. I realized last week that you could hear my stomach gurgling on the microphone. It is kind of right by my stomach, so I apologize. I try not to eat before these sessions so that, I don't know, I'm not burping or anything while I teach. But you might hear my stomach gurgle. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's session. I'm Michelle Duval. This session is part 2 of a workshop that I hosted called Getting the Most Out of Meditation. When I was preparing for that workshop, I realized that when people develop skill with the first 6 steps of getting the most out of meditation that I described in the part 1 workshop, which, don't worry, I'll do a recap of it here at the beginning. But I realized that when people start to develop some skill with those first 6 steps, when they start to develop skill, they start to practice them with some degree of consistency and over a certain amount of time, it can definitely bring us to a place of a deepening experience of meditation. And that's primarily what I'm going to focus on here today in this session, in the part 2 of the workshop, Getting the Most Out of Meditation. What happens when we are able to really commit to those first 6 steps, how that brings us to a place of a deepening practice, and then what happens when we're in this space of deepening practice. That's what I'm going to be focusing primarily on here today. Before I officially get started, I also wanted to share that I'm going to do the very best that I can with describing this aspect of a deepening meditation practice. It can be hard to do. So I just want to acknowledge here at the beginning that I might not do it perfectly. Whenever we start to discuss and describe some of these deeper levels of meditative practice, there are lots of challenges around getting the right words and the right flow and the right A to B to C of things. So I just want to acknowledge that I am not a perfect teacher by any shape of the imagination, but I sure as heck am going to do my very best to describe something that can be difficult to describe. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a recap of these 6 steps that I described in part 1 of this workshop that, as the name implies, that can help us to really get the most out of our meditations. So step 1 is always the same. It's scheduling a time to meditate and then showing up for that time. If you never set a time to do your meditations, you're never going to meditate. Or you might meditate on the fly here and there throughout your life. But really, getting the most out of meditative practice needs this sense of commitment to scheduling a time and then showing up for that scheduled time. So that's always step 1, scheduling a time to meditate, a certain amount of time to meditate, and then actually showing up for that scheduled time. And if you can't show up, you got to reschedule it, right? So as to make sure your practice is happening with some degree of consistency. So that's step 1. Step 2, when we start to meditate, when we've shown up for our time for meditation, is what I call attending to the body. Attending to the body. So I like to encourage people to do just about 4 or so movements and stretches that can help us attend to the body, help relieve some surface tension that we might have in the body, help ourselves to get a little more comfortable in our body. So, like, for example, I always start with reaching my arms up overhead and stretching up through my shoulders and back. I might do that for 30 or 40 seconds, and then I move into my next stretch or movement. I like to encourage students to keep it just around 4 stretches or movements, because when it gets kind of more than that, it starts to really eat into our time for meditation. So we don't want the precursor steps to getting the most out of meditation to actually eat too much into our meditation time, or we won't have enough time to actually do the practice. So that's step 2, attending to the body. And then step 3 is one of the most important kind of precursor to meditative practice steps, and it's what I call settling in. So that's step 3, settling in to your practice. How I think about settling in is in 2 main aspects. So we settle in physically, which entails kind of choosing how you wish to be sitting for that particular practice. So choosing a meditation posture, right? Are you going to be putting some cushions behind your back? Do you need something to support your feet? How are you going to be holding your hands? How are you going to be holding your head, your body, your shoulders? So choosing, kind of accepting a certain meditation posture for your body, and then settling into that posture, which in my mind really includes like accepting your body for as it is. The body is always going to be the body. So there's no way of sitting that can perfectly alleviate all of our aches and pains and itches and twitches. So for most meditators, there still is some discomfort that's going to arise in the body, no matter how good our posture is. So we choose a posture and then we settle into that posture, which is a form of acceptance of the body as it is. The body is still going to be the body as we meditate. And then the second aspect of this settling in step of our entering into meditative practice, the second aspect is a certain degree of settling in to your meditation on the level of mind, right? So just as the body is going to be the body when you meditate, also the mind is going to be the mind. Your thinking mind is still going to create all kinds of thoughts while you meditate. And when we settle in, when we're in this step of settling into our meditative practice, we accept and acknowledge that the body is going to be the body. And we also practice acknowledging and accepting that the thinking mind is still going to be the thinking mind as we meditate. The job of the thinking mind is to create thoughts. That's what it does. The thinking mind creates thoughts, just like the heart pumps blood throughout the body. The thinking mind pumps out thoughts just like the heart pumps out blood. It's its job. So the thinking mind is still going to generate a bunch of thoughts while you meditate. And so in this settling in phase of things, you accept that. Okay, the body's going to be the body and the mind is going to be the mind. We settle in to basically this reality. Sometimes we say we practice in this settling in period, just kind of meeting ourselves where we are. It's not about needing to change ourselves, needing to be better, needing to be less distracted or less achy and painy in the body. No, we meet ourselves exactly where we are in that moment, and then we settle in to how things are. Okay, that's step 3. And then step 4 is choosing a focal point, choosing what you're going to focus on for that particular meditation. So in mindfulness meditation, we always choose a present moment experience as our focal point. So for example, the present moment experience of the breath, or the present moment experience of the various sensations in the body. Or you might be doing a walking meditation, so then it'd be the present moment experiences of how it feels to walk as you meditate. So it's important to understand that your mind is always doing something. Your mind is always doing something. So in normal day-to-day life, your mind is really jumping from focal point to focal point to focal point. So one moment you're focused on reading an email, the next moment you're focused on your sandwich and taking a bite, the next moment you're focused on scratching that mosquito bite, and then the next moment you go back to focusing on the email. That's typically how most people live, right? With your mind jumping between the various focal points of daily living. When we enter meditation, we choose primarily just one thing to focus on, which actually turns out to be an incredibly skillful way to begin to relax the mind. When people first start meditating, it feels really hard for them to just choose, like say, the feeling of the breath as their focal point and then stay with that focal point. But actually, the more that we learn about the mind and what truly relaxes the mind, once you get the hang of it a little bit, choosing a focal point, just one focal point for your meditation, is one of the most skillful ways that we have of actually really relaxing the mind. Okay, so that's step 4, choosing a focal point. As I mentioned, it could be the feeling of the breath, sensations in the body, whatever it is. Now here's where it gets interesting. And here's really what I'm going to try to unpack to a larger degree here in this workshop today. So step 5 is getting distracted from your focal point. That is one of the steps that will occur, will happen for us as we practice meditation. Every single one of us, I've now been meditating for over 20 years, I still fall off my focal point. I still will get distracted into plans, or there'll be my kids making noises in the next room or whatever it is. Once you really acknowledge and accept the fact that you will lose your focus when you meditate, it's actually one of the steps toward getting the most out of meditation. And why I include it as an actual step is because our practice is really about accepting the fact that this will happen. Step 5 is getting distracted from your focal point or losing your focus. And then that brings us to step 6, which is getting yourself refocused on your focal point, bringing the mind back again, bringing your attention back again to what you've chosen to be for your focal point, the feeling of the breath or whatever it is. Now, I started part 1 of this workshop talking about why most people come into meditation in the first place. Most people come into meditation because we're seeking peace, right? We're seeking greater peace. We all want to be happy, and yet So many of us are so deeply confused about what true sources of happiness actually are. And so, in that confusion, in our search to find happiness, many times we spread even more confusion throughout our worlds and cause stress and suffering both for ourselves and for others, because most of us are actually confused about what are true sources of happiness, what actually causes true happiness to arise for both ourselves and others. So within this confusion, we tend to create a lot of stress and suffering for both ourselves and others. And so initially, most people typically come into meditation seeking some healing from this confusion, seeking some peace from our stress, right? And that's what stress reduction is. Stress reduction and seeking peace are really two sides of the same coin. I also talked about in part one that what really enables meditation to take flight in our lives is having the realization that stress is simply wanting things to be other than they are. That's where stress is actually coming from. Wanting things to be other than they are in any given moment in time. So a simple definition of stress is the tension that arises between what is happening and what we want to be happening. When we realize that it's this inner action of wanting things to be other than they are that is actually the cause of our stress. So it's not our boss, it's not our jobs, it's not our neighbor's barking dog, it's not the pain or discomfort that we feel in the body, it's not our health, it's not our children, it's not our finances. Those are all what we call secondary causes and conditions for stress, right? They definitely can stimulate the experience of stress. But the true cause of our stress, where the stress is actually coming from, is from wanting all of that to be different or wanting all of that to be other than it actually is arising for us in any given moment in time. If you continue to blame externals for your stress, you never really fully engage with your meditation practice as a way to really reduce your stress. Most people will stay on the periphery of their meditative practice and really just use their meditations as a way to calm and release some of the byproducts of stress, the tension that they might be feeling in the body or that mental tension that we're feeling in the mind. It's almost a way of managing our stress, right? But once you have that realization that all of those external conditions, and I include the body in these external conditions, once we acknowledge that those are stimulants for our stress for sure, but they're not where the stress is coming from. The stress comes from us wanting the pain to be gone that we're feeling in the body. It comes from us wanting our children to be acting and behaving differently, or our jobs to be different, or our bosses, or our spouses, or whatever it is. Once we really have that realization that the source of the stress is from within us, this wanting things to be other than they are, then we can really start to engage in meditative practice as a way to release us or learn ways of freeing ourselves from this kind of trap of endlessly fighting how life is appearing in any given moment in time. So now here's where there's huge possibility for a deepening meditation practice. And it's in relation to those steps 5 and step 6 that I describe. Step 5 is losing your focus. And step 6 is regaining your focus. So how most people relate to steps 5 and 6, losing your focus and then regaining the focus, is with some degree of frustration, right? To some degree, for most people, when we keep losing our focus and having to regain it, it disturbs our mind. It bothers us. It causes frustration or irritation or even boredom sometimes. I've heard many students tell me that, oh God, it's just so tedious. You lose your focus, you bring it back in. You lose your focus, you bring it back again. And this very phenomenon is one of the primary reasons that most people end up quitting meditation or not liking meditation or feeling like it's too much of a chore or like it's not really working for them or whatever it is. Listen to this, because this is so key and so critical toward a deepening meditative practice. When we can begin to teach ourselves how to not get at all disturbed or bothered or upset or frustrated, like at all, by the fact that we lose our focus and have to regain it over and over and over again, when we cannot be disturbed by this experience at all, when we can teach ourselves what's called equanimity, right? A sense of stability, even though your focus is coming and going. If you can be completely undisturbed by this, you start to enter into another level of meditative practice. So let me connect some of the dots. I just described that the source of our stress is wanting things to be other than they are in any given moment in time. How this primarily surfaces for us in our meditation is within the realm of steps 5 and 6, getting distracted and then having to come back again. So what happens, let's say you're meditating and you're focusing on, say, the feeling of the breath, and then let's say your back starts to ache. So when the back starts to ache, our attention typically leaves our focal point and will shift to the achy back. And then on some level, we get disturbed by the achy back. We're like, oh, this feels bad and I don't want to be feeling this. And we stretch and move, but there's some level of disturbance there on the level of mind. And then so maybe we move and stretch our back and then we refocus on the focal point. When we can feel the achy back, for example, and not have it disturb our mind, you can still move and stretch the body to alleviate what discomfort that you can. But when you can do that with an undisturbed mind, with a calm, peaceful mind, not at all upset or disturbed by the fact that your back is aching, this is what allows us to enter into another stage of meditation. Or if we take another example, let's say I'm focusing on my breath in meditation and my kids start making a bunch of racket. So I get distracted. I'm no longer feeling my breath and I'm suddenly going, darn kids, what are they doing? They know I'm meditating, right? So I've got some disturbance in the mind. And then I come back again to my focal point, to the feeling of the breath. When I can hear the kids, get distracted by the racket they're making, but keep a calm mind, not be disturbed by the fact that that's what's arising for me in the moment. Or in other words, when I can begin to practice in my meditation, moment by moment, not wanting things to be other than they are. Kids are always going to make racket when you're meditating. Your body is going to have aches and pains right up till the end of our lives. That's part of the nature of the body. Your Doorbell is going to ring at times when you're meditating. Your toe is going to get itchy. You're going to start to make plans while you're meditating. So you're going to, remember, step 5 is you're going to get distracted. What if you get distracted, you notice yourself making plans, and instead of getting at all frustrated by the fact that that has happened, what if you could just accept that that has happened? Step 5, you lost your focus, and then simply move back into regaining your focus without getting at all upset that it's happened. Or in other words, when you can, within the realm of steps 5 and 6, begin to practice not wanting things to be other than they are in that moment, you start to enter into a new space of being. You start to enter into the space of acceptance. You start to enter into the space of equanimity. You start to enter into the space of non-judgment. You start to enter into this rarefied space, this incredibly special space of not wanting life or your body or the neighbor's barking dog or your kids or your thinking mind, not wanting any of that to be other than it is in that moment. So how I simplify all of this is when you can teach yourself to be not at all disturbed by the fact that steps 5 and 6 keep happening. This is what opens a new door into a deepening meditation practice. So before I go any further, so the next piece of things is I'm going to start to describe what it feels like, what that experience enables when we enter into this space of not wanting things to be other than they are, of not getting at all disturbed by steps 5 or step 6. But first, let's do a meditation on this aspect of practice, just to give it a try so you can kind of see if you can experience what I'm describing, even if it's just for a moment, right? Okay, so let's get ready to meditate. I will guide you through it. So step 1, we've made a time to meditate, and now here we are, showing up for the meditation. Step 2, attending to the body. Let's do that now. So I'm now on my first movement or stretch out of 4 that I'm going to use to attend to my body. And now I'm going to shift into my second movement. And I'm telling you this just so you can kind of get a sense for the timing of it. So for me, it's kind of rolling through the back and hips and shoulders. And now I'm going to move into my third movement, which for me is rubbing the tension out of my hands. And now we can move into our fourth and final movement, which for me is stretching out my feet. Don't worry, I won't show you my feet. Okay, I always like to signal when I'm shifting from attending to the body into settling in with some deeper breaths. So that's what I'm going to do now. You can join me. 1 or 2 or even 3 nice deep full breaths. And then we're going to allow the breath to return to natural. And we're going to start to move into settling in. So finding and establishing your posture. Meditation posture is defined really by this sense of relaxed alertness throughout the body. We can use how we're holding the body to keep ourselves awake and focused. Relaxed alertness. And then on a physical level, we can just kind of start to accept this posture so that we're not endlessly wiggling and adjusting and modifying. The body's going to be the body. So you just kind of allow your body to settle into your posture. And then on the level of mind, we have to kind of settle in on that level too. So you might already be having tons of thoughts. And in this settling in period, we acknowledge this and we accept it. The thinking mind is going to generate thoughts while we meditate. So as we settle in on the level of mind, we kind of decide that we're not going to follow all the thoughts. It's not that they're not going to arise for us, but we're going to choose to just notice them when they surface, observe them surfacing at times. And we're going to do our best to practice not always following them down each and every rabbit hole, right? That's part of settling in to our meditation practice. Okay, now we can begin to move into the next step, which is choosing our focal point. For this meditation, I'm going to use the breath. So when we choose the breath as our focal point, you begin to find a place in your body that you can most easily and vividly feel your breath. It might be in the nose, the back of the throat, the chest or the belly, doesn't matter. And then we're just going to practice focusing our attention on this present moment feeling of breath, just rising and falling as we breathe. So we're choosing to give our minds just this one thing to do, which is feel the in-breath and feel the out-breath. Remembering that you will wander at times away from this feeling of breath. The body will start to bug you, or sounds, or a fly will land on your nose, or thoughts of all the things you should be doing right now instead of feeling your breath. Whenever you notice yourself losing this connection, this focus to the feeling of breath, see if you can stay completely calm when it happens and simply refocus on the feeling of breath. This is how we wholeheartedly begin to practice not wanting things to be other than they are in any given moment in time. So whatever arises for you that pulls your attention away from your breath, can you practice not being at all disturbed by it? It's just a part of what's arising for us in the moment. Uncomfortable sensations might arise and pull your attention. You can acknowledge those sensations, absolutely. You can adjust the position of your body if that's helpful. Can you practice a calm mind as these sensations arise? And then simply coming back to the breath. No matter what arises, you simply notice and come back to the breath. Just about one more minute. And then as the meditation comes to an end, you can soften your focus and again begin to move and stretch and wholeheartedly attend to the body again. And then just opening your eyes when you're ready. So this past week I've been told I have IBS, right? Irritable bowel syndrome. Sorry if that's TMI, too much info. But it's part of life, right? Can be at times. And this past week, it really went into like a spasm where I was having really bad stomach aches. So they gave me a medicine that helped a lot, just kind of reduce the bowel spasms. But one of the side effects of that medication is it gives you really bad dry mouth. You may have noticed I've been like, my mouth is really dry. So during my meditation, the feeling of discomfort in my mouth, my lips feel really dry, all of that kept coming up while I was meditating, and it would pull my attention away from my breath. And so my practice was to acknowledge the dry mouth, the unpleasant sensations, dry lips, take care of them as much as I could, but keep that calm mind. Keep that practice of not wanting this to not be happening, not wanting things to be other than they are. So when we can begin to shift into this kind of a focus for our practice, when we shift into really our practice is about, as I'm meditating, can I not want things to be other than they are? And how that's primarily going to surface for you is through things that pull your attention away from your focal point. The dry mouth, the achy back, the worry about our kids, the feeling of heartburn, the plans for the weekend, the shame about what happened last weekend, or whatever it is. When we can start to allow that to arise, because it's going to arise whether we like it or not, when we can simply allow it to arise as part of what's arising for us in any given moment in time, and stop fighting it with frustration or boredom or irritation or judgment, when we can start to accept, okay, I got a dry mouth today, okay, hello dry mouth. And now I come back to the feeling of my breath, or whatever it is, when we can start to make that our focus for the meditation. And when you can start to do it a little bit, not saying you can do it for the whole 10 or 20 minutes of meditation, but where we begin is we start to enter into this space of not fighting life. And this is where a really big shift toward a deepening meditative practice can begin to happen. Okay, we're entering into this space now. You can call it what you will, non-judgment. I'm not judging the dryness in my mouth. I feel it, I acknowledge it. I try not to judge it, good or bad, right or wrong. I wish this weren't happening. And just come back to the breath, non-judgment, you can call it. You can call it the space of total acceptance. Oops, there goes my stomach. Of total acceptance, right? It's the space of not wanting things to be other than they are, not fighting life moment by moment. So now listen to this. This is where it gets very interesting very quickly. When we can teach our minds to release the fight against life moment by moment in our meditations, what starts to happen is a whole cascade of physiological changes, which then can enable us to deepen and refine our attention. So typically the body goes where the mind shows. As I start to really commit to giving up the fight against moment to moment life, which is not wanting things to be other than they are, when I can start to release that fight on the level of mind, the body begins to relax on deeper and deeper levels. So for most people, what we describe as relaxation, what we might even describe as deep relaxation, we realize as we begin to deepen our meditation that is really what we call surface relaxation. Deep relaxation really is only enabled when the mind is completely at peace. When the mind releases its tensions, which how we can practice it again is simply practicing equanimity, no bother, when life appears as it does while we're meditating. So it should be noted, I'm not saying like you have to be able to sustain this level of mental peace in your meditation and outside of your meditation all the time. No, we practice it in our meditation. And when you can notice your mind going off into thoughts of worry and simply come back to the breath so there's no mental tension, the body starts to relax on deeper and deeper levels. In fact, most of us might never have even experienced this level of relaxation before in our lives. It's very common to not even really know what this level of deep mental and physiological relaxation actually feels like. As we teach our minds to release this mental tension that's caused by wanting things to be other than they are, the body starts to relax on finer and finer scales, deeper and deeper levels. And one of the byproducts of that happening, of the body relaxing on deeper and deeper levels, is that the body will begin to be less oxygen hungry. Okay? So this is the place where I actually encourage people, if you're doing a walking meditation or a moving meditation, this is the place where I encourage people to just sit down and move into a breathing meditation. And I'll show you why in a moment. Because if you're doing a walking meditation, the body is still going to be oxygen hungry just by the movement, right? If you can sit and instead choose your focal point to be the breath, what happens is as the body enters into these more deeply relaxed states, it needs less oxygen. It becomes less oxygen hungry, which creates a more subtle style of breathing. Or in other words, your breath will here start to become more subtle. So the breath usually follows the needs of the body. The mind is releasing its tension because it's not fighting anything. So the body starts to relax on a deeper level, needing less oxygen as it does so. The breath will then follow that need for less oxygen, and the breath itself starts to become incredibly subtle, almost like we're not breathing at all. It becomes so subtle. Of course we are, but it becomes this incredibly subtle kind of breath, kind of breathing. When we continue paying attention to the breath as it graduates into this more subtle breath, what this necessitates is the creation or the development of a more subtle attention. If you're going to keep paying attention to the breath as it grows more and more subtle, you're going to have to develop a more subtle, more refined level of attention to keep being able to pay attention to the more subtle breath. It takes more subtle attention to be able to pay attention to more subtle phenomenon, to more subtle breathing in this case. So this is one of the primary ways that we have in meditative practices, and this is why, one of the reasons why the choice of the breath as your focal point is so common in meditative practices, in case you were wondering. As the body becomes less oxygen hungry through this deeper level of relaxation, the breath becomes more subtle, and it necessarily draws us into a practice of refining our level of attention. It takes a very subtle attention to be able to pay it to more subtle phenomenon. So sometimes I think about it like this. If you were to want to make a violin, where you would have to start is you'd have to start with like the wood and the saw and the sculpting tools, and it would all be like, you'd be making sawdust as you cut the wood, and it'd all be really like kind of grosser phenomenon as you begin to build the violin. And then as you graduated through the steps of building this violin, or as you progressed through the stages of building the violin, eventually what's going to happen is you're going to have to pay attention to more and more of the subtleties of how the violin is able to produce music. So as the violin becomes more and more refined, your attention in building it has to become more and more refined so that you can pay attention to the subtleties of making the best type of music from that violin. Now the seeds of creating this refined violin is obviously already planted in the wood. You can't use crappy wood to make a stunning violin, right? So the seeds that we've been planting in those first 6 steps, right? The scheduling a time, the focusing on the attending to the body, settling in, all of those steps. Those are like those steps that we're building in the seeds for this graduation of body relaxing on a deeper level, getting less oxygen hungry, creating a more subtle breath that necessitates a more subtle attention for us to be able to continue to pay attention to that more subtle breath. So this turns out to be how we refine and develop a more subtle form of attention. I think my stomach just gurgled. The body. Now, the question becomes, why do we need a more subtle and refined attention? What's the usefulness? What's the utility? If we're going to do this, we want to know what are the benefits of spending this time creating a more subtle and refined attention. And this is where we come into one of the bigger teachings on a deepening meditation practice. Quite honestly, it's when we begin to explore the true usefulness of this development of a more subtle attention, a more refined attention. So when we develop a more subtle attention, it allows us to see and experience the world beyond what we call gross appearances. The cultivation of a more refined, subtle attention allows us to pierce through the way things appear to us, to the naked eye, so to speak. So in our culture, we can all agree that appearances are really, really important to most people. Look at our culture. As soon as anybody gets any type of money, right? If you become a movie star or you're a successful lawyer or doctor or whatever it is, what is it that most people start to fastidiously spend their money on? Getting big houses, buying really nice clothes, buying flashy jewelry, getting expensive makeup, getting their hair done a certain way, driving certain cars, right? All of that is kind of a nod to the fact that appearances are incredibly important to vast levels of our culture, of our society. This is because in order to be able to see beyond appearances, you need a more subtle and refined attention. And most people, without any form of meditative teachings, practices, trainings, do not have this more subtle level of attention developed. So all they can really see are what we call gross appearances, or how things just appear to the naked eye. This is why we are still discussing how important the color of people's skin is. How we look on the outside, the color of our skin, our gender choices. If you're Republican or Democrat, all of this seems super important on the level of mere appearances or gross appearances. When we are able to pierce through these appearances and we begin to see the more subtle nature of reality, we start to see very clearly, and it makes me almost want to cry, that it doesn't matter what color someone's skin is, or what gender they choose to be, or what color my skin is, or my gender choices, or the color of my hair, or how good it looks, or how I look in yoga pants, or how big or small or slender or wide my body is, or how my toenails are, whatever it is that we can get so bothered by, we start to pierce through it with this more subtle or refined attention. And what we start to begin to be able to see, it's just so magnificent, is you start to begin to be able to see the lovability of all living beings, no matter how they appear on the outside, or even, listen to this because this is important, how their actions appear, right? On the level of gross appearances, if one person hits another person, we say, oh, that's a bad person. That's how it appears on the gross level. When we're able to pierce beyond mere appearances, we can see that usually why one person hurts another person is because they themselves are in pain. When people hate other people, it's because they have a certain degree of hatred within themselves, and it's usually toward themselves, and it's usually was cultivated and taught to them in childhood. So even we can use this more subtle or refined attention to be able to pierce through how actions even appear to us. Things that we go, that's just a bad person. With this more subtle and refined level of attention, we see that's a bad behavior. That is a bad and evil action. But we can see beyond it into the basic lovability of all living beings, despite how they might appear or how their actions might appear. And this is the utility or the usefulness of cultivating a more refined and subtle level of being able to pay attention. This is why the meditation masters, who you might know or be following or whatever it is, people you think that are really the teachers on meditation, they don't care what color your skin is. They fight for the rights of all people because they have been able to pierce through gross appearances and see what's beyond it. Oh, that's a living being. And just by the value of being alive, they deserve respect. They deserve care. They deserve love. Regardless of whether they are choosing to be male or female or called they, him, her, whatever, with a more subtle attention, you can pierce beyond this and see this person just wants exactly what I want, which is to be loved and to be respected and to have a space to live out my life in harmony with the world, with all living beings. I know this gets really big and kind of poetic, but this is what it is. And this is how we develop this ability to see beyond appearances, to be able to see beyond appearances and not give a shit about them anymore. Sorry, but that's in a meditative term for sure. To not care so much about how things appear and able to instead keep focused on the basic lovability of all living beings, which includes the earth, which includes plants, which includes animals, which includes caring for the atmosphere, for the environment. When we're able to pierce through the appearance of things and more and more and more live in that space beyond appearance, this is when our hearts get cracked open and we start to feel love for all living beings, love and respect and care, including ourselves. It takes a certain development of a more subtle attention to also be able to pierce through your own appearance. Big dorky Michelle, blonde, tall, kind of bossy, whatever it is, dry mouth. It takes a more subtle appearance to be able to pierce through all that self-judgment, which primarily arises from judging on gross appearances, and not always just how you look, but how your actions appear to yourself. That's why we develop shame or so. Why do you say that? Why do you do that? all of that comes from being hooked into how things appear. When we're able to cultivate this more refined attention, we're able to pierce through it not only with our world, our environment, plants and animals and other human beings, other living beings, but then we're also able to pierce through it with ourselves. And then we're more skillful at including ourselves in the lovability of all of life, just by nature of being alive. But you got to be able to pierce through how things appear to be able to stay connected to this deeper sense of life and love and care and respect. And the only way to pierce through it within the scope of meditative teachings is through this cultivation of a more subtle attention. It's like developing a microscope. If I hold up a leaf, I see the appearance of the leaf. It's green, it's a certain shape. And then I put it under the microscope and I'm like, whoa, wow, there's all these fibers and lines and there's little bugs. And if I get a more and more and more refined microscope, I get to see beyond just the appearance of the leaf at its basic cellular structure, which has huge commonalities with all of life. I can see that with the microscope, or I can see that connection, that sameness amongst all of life when I've developed this more subtle or refined attention. So that's the usefulness. Big, right? Gigantic, enormous. Hope-giving. I hope this also helps you feel hopeful. You can cultivate this. Through part 1 and part 2 of this workshop, I've literally taught you the steps, really. And there are other ways of teaching it. There are other ways of going about it. This is one such approach, definitely in the realm of mindfulness practice. And then with this more subtle attention, this is what the attention that we use to really cultivate like true loving kindness, true wisdom, true compassion. It all takes this more subtle level of attention, this refined attention, to be able to really get into some of the meatier, bigger teachings like on wisdom and true loving kindness, compassion, those things. You can do this. You can do this. It takes a little bit of time. It takes a little bit of consistency, no doubt. It takes scheduling your meditation practice and showing up for it. It takes all of those steps I've described. And you just keep at it. And one day you will start to notice, oh my goodness, there it is. My body is relaxing. Even though my back still might ache, but my body is relaxing. My breath is becoming so soft, so subtle. It's like I'm barely breathing at all. So now I'm going to lean into really paying attention to this more subtle style of breathing, which is going to help me to refine a more subtle level of attention. And then I'm going to use that attention more and more and more with myself, with my friends, my family, my pets, my environment. And then we expand to strangers, community, society, globally from there. Okay. I did my best. I hope so much that this brings you benefit. I'll see you next time.